Retro Rewind, the Sega Genesis. Welcome to Retro Rewind, the show that plugs you back into the pixels, polygons, and personalities that shaped the world of gaming. Today, we're setting our time machine for the turn of the 1990s to look at a console that didn't just challenge a titan, but started a war. It was a sleek, black box of rebellion, the vessel for a new kind of attitude, and one half of the most legendary corporate rivalry in entertainment history. It promised to bring the arcade into your living room, and it delivered with a scream. Today, we rewind to the era of the Sega Genesis. Introduction: the black sheep of the playground. To understand the arrival of the Sega Genesis, you have to understand the world it was born into. By the late 1980s, Nintendo was not just a company, it was a kingdom. With its Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, it had single-handedly resurrected the North American video game market from the ashes of the 1983 crash and achieved a level of market dominance that seems almost mythical today, capturing nearly 95% of the console sector. The NES was king, and its name was synonymous with video games. To a generation of children, playing video games wasn't just playing video games, it was playing Nintendo. But this dominance was built on a carefully cultivated, family-friendly image. Nintendo was for kids. Its mascot was a cheerful plumber, its games were colorful and whimsical, and its corporate policies were famously restrictive, keeping a tight leash on third-party developers to ensure all content met its squeaky clean standards. This created a cultural monolith, a single unified vision of what video games were supposed to be. Into this world stepped a challenger, a company forged not in the living rooms of Japan, but in the noisy, neon-lit arcades that dotted every street corner and shopping mall. This company was Sega. And it was not interested in being another Nintendo. It saw an audience that Nintendo was ignoring, the teenagers and young adults who had grown up on the NES, but were now looking for something faster, louder, and cooler. Sega's weapon in this fight was a 16-bit powerhouse, a black console that looked more like a high-end stereo component than a child's toy. In North America, they called it the Genesis, a name chosen to symbolize a new beginning for video games. But the Genesis was more than just a piece of hardware. It was a declaration of intent. It was the physical embodiment of a counterculture. Its marketing was aggressive and unapologetic, taking direct aim at the king with slogans like, "Genesis does what Nintendon't." Its mascot wasn't a slow, methodical plumber, but a blue hedgehog with supersonic speed and a rebellious attitude. What followed was not just a competition over market share, it was the first great console war. A cultural battle fought on playgrounds, in bedrooms, and through blistering television commercials across the country. You were either a Nintendo kid or a Sega kid. There was no middle ground. This was the story of the underdog, the black sheep of the playground, the company that dared to challenge a monopoly, and in doing so, changed the video game industry forever. Chapter 1: The Arcade Kings in a Console Kingdom. To understand the rebellious spirit that fueled the Sega Genesis, one must first understand the unique and complex history of the company that created it. Unlike its rival Nintendo, which began its life over a century earlier making playing cards, Sega's DNA was forged in a very different crucible: the onset of the coin-operated amusement industry of post-World War II Japan, founded and shaped by American entrepreneurs. From service games to arcade dominance. The story of Sega begins not in Japan, but in Honolulu, Hawaii. In 1940, with the number of military personnel swelling at the onset of World War II, American businessmen Martin Bromley, Irving Bromberg, and James Humpert formed Standard Games to provide coin-operated amusement machines to military bases. After the war, this venture was reformed as Service Games. In 1952, Bromley sent 2 employees to Tokyo to establish a new distributor, Service Games of Japan, which primarily supplied coin-operated slot machines to U.S. bases in the country. The name Sega, a simple abbreviation of Service Games, was first stamped onto a slot machine called the Diamond Star in 1954. At the same time, another American, David Rosen, was building his own business empire in Tokyo. An Air Force veteran who had served in Japan during the Korean War founded Rosen Enterprises in 1954. initially exporting Japanese art to America before finding immense success by importing coin-opt photo booths, which became ubiquitous across Japan. In 1957, Rosen pivoted to importing American coin-op amusement games, creating gun corners in stores that allowed Japanese citizens for whom firearms were illegal to experience target shooting simulations. These two parallel streams of American entrepreneurship in Japan finally converged in 1965. Rosen Enterprises merged with Nihon Goraku Busan, the successor to Service Games of Japan, to form a new entity, Sega Enterprises Limited, with David Rosen installed as CEO. The new company quickly shifted from importing machines to manufacturing their own. This decision was born of necessity. The second-hand American machines required constant maintenance, and it was simply more efficient to build their own. Sega's first major original creation was the 1966 submarine simulator Periscope, an electromechanical marvel that became a global sensation. Its innovative use of light and sound effects captivated audiences, and it was so successful upon export to the United States that it is credited with standardizing the 25-cent per play cost for arcade games. This success transformed Sega into a major force in the burgeoning arcade industry. In 1969, the company was acquired by the American conglomerate Gulf and Western Industries, with David Rosen remaining as CEO. Throughout the 1970s and into the early 1980s, Sega solidified its position as one of the top 5 arcade manufacturers in the world. It released a string of innovative and successful titles, including Pongtron in 1973, its first video-based game, Head-On in 1979, which introduced the Eat the Dots gameplay later popularized by Pac-Man, and the groundbreaking Zaxxon in 1982, the first game to use isometric graphics. By 1982, Sega's revenues had climbed to over $214 million. This period also saw the rise of a key figure in Sega's future, Hayao Nakayama. Nakayama was the founder of a distribution company called Esco Trading, which was acquired by Sega in 1979. Recognizing his ambition and leadership, David Rosen placed Nakayama in a senior management role within Sega's Japanese operations. Sega's identity was now clear. It was an arcade company through and through. Its business was built on creating powerful, cutting-edge hardware that delivered immediate, visceral thrills to an audience of teenagers and young adults. This arcade DNA would become both its greatest strength and, in the years to come, its most profound weakness. The first foray, the Master System's failure. The video game crash of 1983, which decimated the American home console market, also sent shockwaves through the arcade business. The downturn hit Sega hard, leading its parent company, Gulf and Western Industries, to sell off most of its American assets. However, it retained the Japanese subsidiary, Sega Enterprises Limited. In 1984, in a pivotal management buyout, David Rosen and Nakayama, with financial backing from the Japanese conglomerate CSK Corporation, purchased Sega's Japanese assets. Nakayama was installed as the new CEO of the independent Sega Enterprises Limited. With the arcade business in a slump, the fiercely ambitious Nakayama advocated for Sega to leverage its hardware expertise and enter the burgeoning home console market in Japan. This led to the release of the SG-1000, followed by its successor, the Sega Mark III, in 1985. The Mark III was a technically impressive 8-bit machine. When redesigned for the North American market and released in 1986 as the Sega Master System, it was, in many respects, a superior piece of hardware to the dominant Nintendo Entertainment System. However, technical superiority meant little in the face of Nintendo's iron-fisted control of the market. Nintendo's licensing policies were notoriously restrictive, famously requiring that any game released on the NES could not be published on a competing console for 2 years. This effectively locked third-party developers into Nintendo's ecosystem, starving the Master System of the broad software library it needed to compete. While the Master System found considerable success in Europe and Brazil, where Nintendo's presence was less established, it was a commercial disaster in the all-important North American market. The situation was made catastrophically worse by a disastrous business decision. In 1987, amid struggling sales, Sega of America handed over the U.S. distribution rights for the Master System to the toy company Tonka. The logic seemingly was to emulate Nintendo's successful strategy of marketing the NES as a toy to retailers and parents. But Tonka had no experience with electronic entertainment systems. The deal proved a fatal misstep. Tonka, facing its own financial difficulties after acquiring Kenner Toys, mismanaged the console, blocked the localization of popular Japanese games, and failed to secure the necessary components for cartridge manufacturing during an industry-wide EEPROM shortage. The failure was total. By 1988, Nintendo controlled 83% of the North American video game market. The Master System was a non-entity, a footnote in a market utterly dominated by a single player. For Sega, it was a humiliating defeat, but it was also a critical learning experience. The company learned two vital lessons. First, that hardware alone was not enough. A successful console needed a deep and diverse library of games, which meant courting third-party developers. And second, and perhaps more importantly, they learned that they could not outsource their ambition. The hands-off approach of the Tonka deal had been a catastrophe. If they were ever going to
Chapter 2: Forging the Black Sword, the Birth of the Mega Drive. Even as the Master System was failing to gain a foothold in North America and Japan, Sega's leadership knew they could not stand still. The 8-bit era was aging, and the future was 16-bit. With NEC's PC Engine, known as the TurboGrafx 16 in North America, already on the market in Japan, and rumors of Nintendo's own 16-bit successor swirling, Sega's console R&D team was tasked with creating a new machine that could leapfrog the competition. The project, supervised by veteran hardware designer Hideki Sato and led by Masami Ishikawa, began almost immediately after the Master System's launch. An arcade heart in a console body. The core philosophy behind the new console was to play to Sega's greatest strength, its dominance in the arcades. Rather than designing a home console from scratch, Ishikawa's team made a revolutionary decision. They would adapt the architecture of Sega's powerful and successful System 16 arcade board for home use. This was a move that would fundamentally define the new machine's character. The System 16 was the hardware that powered a string of Sega's arcade hits, and by building their console on its foundation, they were ensuring it would be uniquely capable of delivering the fast-paced, graphically intense arcade experience that would become its central marketing promise. The most critical decision in the console's development came late in the process, the choice of a central processing unit, or CPU. The team selected the powerful Motorola 68000 microprocessor. This was not a typical console CPU. The 68000 was a versatile 1632-bit chip used in high-end personal computers of the era, such as the Apple Macintosh and the Commodore Amiga, and, crucially, in a multitude of arcade machines. Clocked at a blistering 7.6 MHz, it was more than twice as fast as the processor that would eventually power the Super Nintendo. It was the key to unlocking the speed and processing power needed for the kinds of games Sega wanted to make. There was just one problem. The chip was expensive. Including it would have driven the console's retail price to uncompetitive levels. In a moment of shrewd business acumen that proved vital to the project's success, Sega's management negotiated a deal with a distributor to purchase the chips at a fraction of their market price, securing the deal with a massive upfront volume order and the promise of more to come if the console was a hit. With its arcade heart secured, the console's design could be finalized. Led by Mitsushige Shirowaya, the design team drew inspiration not from toys, but from high-end audiophile equipment and luxury automobiles. The resulting machine was sleek, black, and sophisticated. A prominent circular molding around the cartridge slot evoked a CD player, and the words 16-bit were embossed in a striking gold metallic veneer on the casing, a deliberate choice to create an impression of power and maturity. This was a machine designed to appeal to all ages, a stark visual contrast to the gray, boxy, and distinctly toy-like Famicom that was aimed squarely at children. A new beginning, from Mega Drive to Genesis. On October 29, 1988, The console launched in Japan under the name Mega Drive. The launch, however, was overshadowed by the release of Nintendo's Super Mario Bros. 3 just a week earlier, a cultural event that consumed the attention of the Japanese gaming public. While the initial shipment of the Mega Drive sold out, it struggled to gain long-term traction, remaining a distant third in its home market behind the dominant Super Famicom and NEC's PC Engine. Sega had successfully built a powerful machine, but in Japan, the kingdom of Nintendo still held firm. The real war, however, would be fought in North America. Sega's American division knew that a simple rebranding was necessary. The name Mega Drive was already trademarked in the US by another company. But more than that, they needed a name that would resonate with the American market and signal a clean break from the failure of the Master System. Michael Katz, the then CEO of Sega of America, championed the name Genesis. It was cool, evocative, and perfectly symbolized what Sega was trying to achieve. A new beginning, not just for Sega, but for the entire video game industry. The Black Sword had been forged. Now it was time to draw it. Chapter 3. The Beachhead. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. The Sega Genesis launched in North America in a limited release on August 14, 1989, a full 2 years before its primary rival, the Super Nintendo, would arrive in American shores. This head start was a critical window of opportunity, and the man tasked with exploiting it was Michael Katz, the new president of Sega of America. Michael Katz, a veteran of the toy industry, understood that to challenge a giant like Nintendo, which held a staggering 94% of the market, Sega couldn't just sell a console, it had to sell an attitude. His strategy was to establish a firm beachhead in the American market by creating a brand identity that was the polar opposite of Nintendo's. The centerpiece of Katz's strategy was a marketing campaign that was, for the video game industry at the time, utterly revolutionary in its audacity. Developed with the advertising agency Basel, the campaign's slogan was a direct, unambiguous shot across the bow of the market leader. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. This wasn't a polite comparison, it was a playground taunt elevated to the level of corporate strategy. It was provocative, feisty, and irreverent, and it fundamentally changed the nature of console advertising. The campaign brilliantly exploited Sega's 2-year head start. The Nintendo-don't slogan wasn't comparing the 16-bit Genesis to the upcoming 16-bit Super Nintendo, it was comparing it to the 8-bit NES that was currently sitting in millions of American homes. The television and print ads hammered this point home, showcasing the Genesis's vibrant colors, detailed sprites, and smooth scrolling, making the aging NES look primitive by comparison. This technological superiority was framed as part of a broader cultural divide. Katz recognized that the core arcade audience was not young children, but teenagers and young adults. This was the demographic Nintendo was largely ignoring. Katz later recalled, "I looked at who was playing in the arcades, and it wasn't 6 to 12-year-old boys, it was teenagers and young adults. They went there because that's where the best games were, and that's also where the girls were. I said, this is my market." The Genesis does what Nintendo don't campaign was therefore a two-pronged attack. It highlighted the console's superior hardware while simultaneously positioning it as the cooler, more mature choice. Nintendo didn't do realistic licensed sport simulations. Nintendo didn't do violence. Nintendo didn't have rock and roll soundtracks in their commercials. Sega did. The arsenal of attitude. To back this marketing, Katz focused on building a software library that would appeal to this older demographic. The initial lineup was built on the promise of bringing the arcade experience home. The first pack-in game was Altered Beast, a port of the popular arcade brawler. It was soon followed by other arcade hits like the fantasy-themed beat-em-up Golden Axe and the sci-fi shooter Space Harrier 2, games that were staples of the very arcades Sega was targeting. But Katz knew that arcade ports alone wouldn't be enough. He needed games with recognizable names that could compete with the cultural behemoth that was Mario. This led to an aggressive pursuit of celebrity endorsements and high-profile licenses that Nintendo, with its conservative image, wouldn't touch. Sega of America secured deals for games based on sports icons like Joe Montana, Pat Riley, and Tommy Lasorda. The competition for these licenses was fierce. Katz later recounted with satisfaction how Sega outbid Nintendo of America's chairman, Howard Lincoln, for the rights to Joe Montana, a victory that he cited as signaling that we were beginning to gain traction. The ultimate coup for this strategy was securing the rights to create a game based on the world's biggest pop star, Michael Jackson. The resulting game, Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, released in 1990, was a massive hit and the perfect embodiment of the Nintendon't philosophy. It was built around the music and persona of a global icon known for his edgy and sophisticated style. Jackson himself was reportedly a fan of Sega's arcade games and was personally involved in the game's development, contributing to its design and, of course, its synthesized soundtrack of his greatest hits. The game, where players control Jackson as he uses dance moves to defeat gangsters and rescue children, was a unique and stylish title that felt worlds away from the Mushroom Kingdom. A foundation for the future. Michael Katz's tenure at the head of Sega of America was relatively short. In his first year, he had managed to sell 500,000 Genesis consoles. By any reasonable measure, this was a significant achievement, establishing a solid beachhead in a market that had been 94% controlled by a single competitor.
Chapter 4. The Kalinske Doctrine, a Plan for Domination. The arrival of Tom Kalinske as CEO of Sega of America in mid-1990 marked the moment the console war escalated from a series of skirmishes into total war. Kalinske was not a video game industry insider. He was a marketing veteran from the famously cutthroat world of the toy industry, having served as CEO of Mattel, where he was credited with reviving the Barbie and Hot Wheels brands and launching the cultural phenomenon Masters of the Universe. He understood mass-market consumer branding, and he saw in the Genesis an opportunity to apply those principles to overthrow an empire. After a swift analysis of the market, Kalinske flew to Japan to meet with Hayao Nakayama and the Sega board of directors. He came armed with a radical, four-point plan that he believed was the key to not just competing with Nintendo, but dominating them. The four-point plan. Kalinske's strategy, which would become legendary in the annals of business history, was a masterclass in market disruption. It was built on four key pillars. Cut the price. The Super Nintendo was launching in North America in 1991 at a price point of $299. Kalinske proposed slashing the price of the Genesis from its original $189 down to $149, making it a significantly more attractive value proposition for consumers on the fence. This was a direct price war, a tactic common in consumer goods, but less so in the console space at the time. Replace the pack in-game. The Genesis was bundled with Altered Beast, a solid but niche arcade port. Kalinske argued that this was a wasted opportunity. He insisted on replacing it with Sega's new in-development mascot game, a title that was designed from the ground up to showcase the console's speed and power, Sonic the Hedgehog. Continue and escalate aggressive marketing. Kalinske believed Michael Katz's Genesis does what Nintendon't campaign was the right approach, but that it didn't go far enough. He wanted to double down on the strategy, to not just name the competition, but to actively ridicule them. The goal was to cement the image of Nintendo as the kiddie console and Sega as the cool, edgy choice for the discerning teenager. This would evolve into the iconic Sega Scream and Welcome to the Next Level television campaigns, which were loud, fast-paced, and dripping with attitude. Build an American software team. Recognizing that Japanese-developed games didn't always resonate with American tastes, Kalinske pushed for the creation of a US-based development team. This team would be focused on creating games specifically for the American market, with a heavy emphasis on sports titles like football and basketball, genres that were massively popular in the US but often underserved by Japanese developers. A corporate showdown.
The reaction from Sega of Japan's board of directors was one of uniform horror. They rejected every single point of Kalinsky's plan. They were a hardware company. Cutting the price of the console would destroy their margins. They were a software company. Giving away their most promising new game, Sonic the Hedgehog, for free was corporate suicide. It meant sacrificing millions in high-margin software sales. The idea of directly ridiculing a respected competitor like Nintendo was seen as distasteful and dishonorable. And the notion of building a major development studio in America ran counter to the Japan-centric focus of the company. As Kalinsky himself later recounted, "I thought that, well, this was the shortest career anyone ever had. That's it, 3 months and I have to find another job." But in that boardroom, a pivotal moment occurred. Hayao Nakayama, Sega's powerful and visionary CEO, listened to the board's objections and then turned to Kalinsky. In a decision that would change the course of video game history, he overruled his entire board. He famously told Kalinsky, "I hired you to make the decisions for Europe and the Americas, so go ahead and do it." This single act of faith was monumental. It granted Sega of America a level of autonomy that was unprecedented for a Japanese company's overseas division. This freedom allowed Kalinsky to execute his strategy perfectly, tailoring Sega's products and marketing to the unique tastes of the American market. It was a relationship that would lead to incredible success, but it also planted the seeds of a deep cultural and strategic rift between the two branches of the company, a rift that would have catastrophic consequences in the years to come. The Kalinsky Doctrine was more than just a marketing plan. It was a fundamental shift in business philosophy. The decision to bundle Sonic the Hedgehog was particularly revolutionary. Kalinsky understood something that the Sega board did not. The goal was not to sell Sonic cartridges, the goal was to sell Genesis consoles. By including Sonic, he transformed the Genesis from a $149 box of electronics into a $149 Sonic machine. It was a classic loss leader strategy, sacrificing short-term software profits for long-term market share. It dramatically increased the console's perceived value and gave consumers a powerful, immediate reason to choose Sega. The plan was in place. All it needed was a hero. Chapter 5. The Blue Blur, Engineering an Icon. Before Tom Kalinsky could bundle a mascot with the Genesis, Sega needed to create one. In 1990, Sega's president Hayao Nakayama recognized that to truly compete with Nintendo, Sega needed its own star character, an icon who could go toe-to-toe with Mario. An internal contest was held to design a new flagship game and a mascot to go with it, with a specific focus on appealing to the American audience. The project that would ultimately win was the result of a collaboration between 3 key talents who would become the founding members of Sonic Team. The Holy Trinity: Naka, Oshima, and Yasuhara. The first was Yuji Naka, a brilliant programmer who was already a veteran at Sega, having worked on acclaimed titles like the original Phantasy. The gameplay concept for Sonic originated with a tech demo Naka had made, which featured a character rolling rapidly in a ball through a long, winding tube. The demo was a pure expression of speed, built on a clever algorithm Naka developed that allowed a sprite to move smoothly along a curve. The second was Nato Oshima, a talented artist and designer. Oshima had submitted several character concepts for the contest. His initial idea was a rabbit with prehensile ears that could pick up and throw objects, but the concept proved too complex for the hardware to handle smoothly. The team then shifted its focus to animals that could roll into a ball to fit Naka's gameplay prototype. They considered an armadillo and a hedgehog, ultimately settling on Oshima's design for a spiky, teal-colored hedgehog. The character's color was chosen to match Sega's cobalt blue logo, his shoes were inspired by the cover of Michael Jackson's album Bad, and his confident, slightly impatient personality was based on Bill Clinton's can-do attitude. 8. The villain Dr. Eggman, or Dr. Robotnik in the West, was another of Oshima's designs from the contest, repurposed as the hero's nemesis. The third crucial member was Hirokazu Yasuhara, a game planner and level designer. Yasuhara's role was to take Naka's engine and Oshima's character and build a compelling game world around them. He was the architect of the Green Hill Zone and the other iconic levels, designing the intricate paths, loops, and secret areas that made the game's speed so exhilarating. When Tom Kalinsky saw the nearly completed game, he knew it was the key to his entire strategy. Despite the fierce opposition from Sega of Japan, he fought to have Sonic the Hedgehog replace Altered Beast as the pack-in game. The decision paid off spectacularly.
Launched on June 23, 1991, Sonic the Hedgehog was a critical and commercial phenomenon. The game's incredible speed, vibrant graphics, and infectious attitude were a revelation. It gave the Genesis the system seller it desperately needed and provided Sega with a mascot who was the perfect antithesis to Mario: fast, cool, and a little bit edgy. As a bundled title, the game would go on to sell over 15 million copies, single-handedly driving the Genesis to the top of the sales charts.
A Tale of Two Sonics. The success of the first game led to immediate demand for a sequel. However, by this point, a creative rift had begun to form. Yuji Naka, dissatisfied with his compensation and lack of credit for the first game's success, had actually quit Sega. He was lured back not by Sega of Japan, but by Mark Cerny of Sega of America, who offered him a higher salary and more creative freedom to work at the newly formed Sega Technical Institute, STI, in California. Yasuhara also made the move to STI. This led to a unique situation where the sequel to Sega's biggest Japanese-created hit was developed primarily in the United States. Sonic the Hedgehog 2, released in 1992, was a product of this new, combined Japanese-American team at STI. It introduced Sonic's sidekick, Tails the Two-Tailed Fox, and the iconic spin dash move, refining and expanding on the original's formula to massive success, selling over 6 million copies. Meanwhile, back in Japan, Naoto Oshima led a separate team to create a Sonic game for Sega's new CD-ROM add-on, the Sega CD. This project, Sonic CD 1993, took a different creative direction. It featured a time travel mechanic, lush, high-quality animated cutscenes, and a distinctive CD audio soundtrack. The parallel development of Sonic 2 in America and Sonic CD in Japan created a friendly but intense rivalry between the two teams, each trying to outdo the other and create the definitive Sonic experience. This creative friction, born from the unique trans-Pacific structure of Sega at the time, resulted in two of the most beloved and distinct entries in the entire series. The Blue Blur had not only saved the Genesis, he had become a global icon. Chapter 6. The Arsenal, A Tale of Two Philosophies. The battle between the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo was not just a war of marketing slogans and mascots. It was a fundamental clash of hardware design philosophies. Each console was a reflection of its creator's corporate identity. Sega, the king of the arcades, built a machine that prioritized raw speed and processing power. Nintendo, the master of the home console, crafted a system that favored rich graphical and auditory experiences. This technical divide fueled the endless playground debates of the era and gave each console's games a distinct and recognizable feel. The myth and reality of blast processing. The most famous weapon in this technical arms race was Sega's marketing buzzword, blast processing. The term was plastered across advertisements, which confidently declared the Sega Genesis has blast processing, Super Nintendo doesn't. To a generation of young gamers, it was a powerful and mysterious concept that promised unparalleled speed. The reality of blast processing is a fascinating story that is simultaneously true, misleading, and rooted in an obscure technical quirk. The truth at the heart of the marketing was simple. The Genesis was faster than the SNES. Its Motorola 68000 CPU ran at 7.6 MHz, more than double the 3.58 MHz clock speed of the SNES's Ricoh 5A22 processor. This significant advantage in raw processing power meant the Genesis could handle calculations more quickly, enabling faster scrolling, more on-screen action without slowdown, and the kind of high-velocity gameplay that defined games like Sonic the Hedgehog. In this sense, blast processing was a brilliant, catchy marketing term for a very real and significant hardware advantage. However, the term itself originated from something far more specific and obscure. During the console's development, Sega's technical director Marty Franz discovered a trick involving the Genesis's video display processor, or VDP. By timing a direct memory transfer to coincide perfectly with the television's electron beam drawing a scan line, it was theoretically possible to blast data directly to the graphics chip mid-frame. This could have been used to overcome the console's color limitations and display more than its standard 64 on-screen colors. However, this technique was incredibly difficult to implement and temperamental. As a result, no commercial Genesis game actually used it. The marketing team, however, loved the sound of the phrase blast processing and with a stroke of genius repurposed it to refer to the console's much more tangible and easily demonstrated CPU speed advantage. It was a masterstroke that translated a dry technical specification, CPU clock speed, into a powerful, memorable concept that perfectly encapsulated the brand's identity and gave Sega fans a definitive weapon for their playground arguments. A clash of sights and sounds. While the Genesis had the edge in speed, the Super Nintendo's strengths lay in its specialized custom chips for graphics and sound. The SNES could display 256 colors on screen at once, drawn from a massive palette of 32,768. The Genesis, by comparison, was limited to just 64 on-screen colors from a palette of 512. This vast difference gave Sonic games a richer, more vibrant, and more detailed look. It's the difference between the stark, bold color choices of Streets of Rage 2 and the lush, painterly world of The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The most dramatic difference, however, was in the audio. The Genesis used a Yamaha YM2612, a 6-channel FM synthesis sound source, supplemented by a 4-channel Texas Instruments PSG chip, the same one used in the Master System. FM synthesis is excellent at creating bright, punchy, metallic, and percussive sounds. This gave Genesis music its signature synthy and often gritty character, perfectly suited for the high-energy techno soundtracks of games like Streets of Rage or the driving rock of Road Rash. The Super Nintendo, on the other hand, featured a revolutionary sound chip designed by a young Sony engineer named Ken Kutaragi. This was an 8-channel, sample-based audio chip. Instead of generating sounds through frequency modulation, it could play back small, pre-recorded digital audio samples. This allowed for far more realistic-sounding instruments and enabled composers to create rich, layered, near CD-quality orchestral scores. It was the magic behind the soaring opera scene in Final Fantasy VI and the atmospheric, ambient soundscapes of Super Metroid. While the Genesis's sound had a raw, energetic charm, the SNES's audio capabilities were, by almost any objective measure, a full generation ahead. Let's stack these two 16-bit powerhouses side by side, the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, and see where each one flexed its muscles. Think of it less like a cold spec sheet and more like a ringside commentary on a heavyweight match. First up, the brains of the operation, the main CPU. Genesis packed a Motorola 68000, a 1632-bit workhorse that powered Sega's famous blast processing. The SNES used a Ricoh 5A22, solid but purely 16-bit. Winner? Genesis. That Motorola 68000 gave Sega the raw horsepower to push fast, fluid gameplay. Clock speed? Genesis was running at about 7.6 MHz, more than double the 3.58 MHz clock speed of the SNES. That meant quicker scrolling and faster action, another point for Genesis. But visuals are another story. On-screen colors? Genesis could show 64 at once. The SNES? 256. That's richer, more vibrant, and more detailed art. No contest, the SNES takes this round. Total color palette? Genesis topped out at 512 colors. The SNES, 32,768. That's not just a win, that's a landslide. Artists had way more shades to play with on Nintendo's system. Resolution capabilities? Genesis usually ran at 320 by 224. The SNES could hit 512 by 448 in interlaced mode, though most games stayed around the 256 by 224. Still, on paper, the SNES edges ahead here. Sound chips, a huge part of the experience. Genesis combined the Yamaha YM2612 for that signature 6-channel FM synth with a TI PSG for extra channels. It was raw, punchy, and perfect for arcade-style tunes. The SNES had the Sony SMP, 8 channels, sample-based audio. That meant real-sounding instruments and lush orchestral scores. It was the magic behind the soaring opera scene in Final Fantasy VI and the atmospheric, ambient soundscapes of Super Metroid. While the Genesis's sound had a raw, energetic charm, the SNES's audio capabilities were, by almost any objective measure, a full generation ahead. Ultimately, neither philosophy was definitively better. They were simply different. The Genesis was a sprinter, built for speed and raw power. The SNES was a painter, equipped with a richer palette and a more sophisticated voice. This hardware divergence created two distinct canvases, upon which a generation of developers would create a diverse and timeless library of masterpieces. Chapter 7: The Library of a Rebel King. A console, no matter how powerful, is ultimately defined by its games. It was here, in the breadth and character of its software library, that the Sega Genesis truly cemented its legacy. Sega of America's strategy of positioning the Genesis as the more open, cooler alternative to Nintendo had a profound effect on the types of developers and games it attracted. Nintendo's strict licensing policies had created a pool of ambitious developers eager for a new platform, and Sega welcomed them with open arms. This resulted in a library that was a unique coalition of four distinct pillars: Sega's own arcade-perfect conversions, the American sports dominance of Electronic Arts, groundbreaking titles from Western third parties, and polished action masterpieces from Sega of Japan.
Arcade in your home. The foundational promise of the Genesis was its ability to bring the arcade experience into the living room, and its early library delivered on that promise unequivocally. 1. The console's architecture, derived from the System 16 arcade board, made it the perfect platform for porting Sega's own coin-op hits. Games like Altered Beast, Golden Axe, Strider, and Ghouls and Ghosts were not just approximations, they were remarkably faithful conversions that captured the look, feel, and speed of their arcade counterparts. For the teenagers who had been pumping quarters into these machines at the local mall, the ability to have that same experience at home was a powerful selling point and a tangible fulfillment of the "Genesis does what Nintendon't" slogan. The renegade publisher, the rise of EA Sports. No single third-party publisher was more important to the Genesis's success in North America than Electronic Arts. The story of their partnership is a legendary tale of corporate hardball. When EA, then a burgeoning publisher of PC games, approached Sega about developing for the Genesis, they were met with the standard, restrictive licensing terms that were common in the industry. Unwilling to accept a deal that would cede creative control and a significant portion of their profits, EA's executives, led by founder Trip Hawkins, decided on a radical course of action. Under the guidance of their legal counsel, EA's engineers undertook a clean room reverse engineering of the Genesis hardware. One team would analyze the console and document its functions without ever looking at the proprietary code. A second team, using only those documents, would then build a functional equivalent. It was a legally perilous but technically brilliant maneuver. Armed with their own proprietary development tools and the ability to manufacture their own cartridges without Sega's approval, EA approached Sega again. This time, they held all the cards. Faced with the prospect of a major publisher releasing unlicensed games for their system, Sega had no choice but to acquiesce. EA secured an unprecedentedly favorable licensing deal that gave them complete creative control, the ability to manufacture their own cartridges, and a much more generous royalty rate. This renegade partnership was a turning point. EA, with its deep understanding of the American market, threw its weight behind the Genesis. They were particularly dominant in the genre of sports simulations. Titles like John Madden Football, NHL 94, and NBA Live became annual system sellers. These games, with their focus on realism, statistics, and licenses from major sports leagues, appealed directly to the older male demographic that Sega was courting. The iconic yellow tab on EA's uniquely shaped cartridges became a seal of quality and a ubiquitous sight in any Genesis owner's collection. 5. The partnership was so successful that Electronic Arts became the single largest third-party publisher for the console, and the Genesis became the undisputed king of sports gaming for a generation. The Culture War, Mortal Kombat, and the birth of the ESRB. If EA Sports helped define the Genesis's mature image, it was the controversy surrounding two specific games that cemented it. The first was the arcade fighting game phenomenon, Mortal Kombat. When the game was ported to home consoles in 1993, Nintendo, adhering to its strict family-friendly policies, insisted on a censored version. The game's signature blood was replaced with gray sweat, and the graphic fatality finishing moves were toned down or removed entirely. Sega saw an opportunity. The Genesis version of Mortal Kombat was also censored by default, but it contained a secret. By entering a simple code at the title screen, AB, AC, ABB, players could unlock the blood code, restoring all the gore and graphic fatalities from the arcade original. This small addition had massive repercussions. Word of the code spread like wildfire on playgrounds and in gaming magazines. The Genesis version of Mortal Kombat massively outsold its Super Nintendo counterpart. It was the ultimate Genesis does what Nintendon't moment, a clear and defiant statement that Sega was the platform for the uncensored, authentic arcade experience. This, combined with the public outcry over Night Trap, a full-motion video game for the Sega CD that featured a controversial scene involving the capture of a scantily clad teenage girl, brought the issue of video game violence to the national stage. In late 1993 and early 1994, Senators Joe Lieberman and Herb Kohl convened a series of U.S. Senate hearings on video game violence. Footage from both Mortal Kombat and Night Trap was shown as evidence of the industry's excesses, and Congress threatened to impose federal regulations. In response to this pressure, the video game industry chose to self-regulate. Sega, which had already created its own Video Game Rating Council, or VRC, joined with Nintendo and other industry players to form the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB, in 1994. The system of age-based ratings, E for everyone, T for teen, M for mature, that was created as a direct result of the controversy surrounding Sega's games, remains the industry standard to this day. Unwittingly, by embracing its edgy, rebellious image, Sega had forced the entire industry to mature. Masterpieces from the East. While Sega of America was busy fighting the culture war, Sega of Japan's internal development teams were producing a steady stream of polished, critically acclaimed masterpieces that formed the artistic core of the Genesis library. Phantasy Star. The premier Japanese RPG series on the Genesis, Phantasy Star had begun its life on the Master System as Sega's answer to Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. The series truly came into its own on the 16-bit hardware. Phantasy Star 2, 1989, was a massive, challenging epic with a mature science fiction storyline that stood in contrast to the medieval fantasy of its rivals. While the third installment, Generations of Doom, was a divisive departure, the series concluded its 16-bit run with the magnificent Phantasy Star 4, The End of the Millennium, 1993 in Japan, 1995 in the US. This final entry is widely regarded as one of the greatest RPGs of its era, featuring a fast-paced battle system, engaging characters, and a unique comic book-style presentation for its cutscenes. Streets of Rage. In the world of beat-em-ups, Capcom's Final Fight was the undisputed arcade king, but since Capcom had an exclusivity deal with Nintendo, the Genesis needed its own brawler. Sega's AM-17 delivered with Streets of Rage, 1991. The game, and its even more acclaimed sequel, Streets of Rage 2, 1992, set a new standard for the genre on home consoles. With its tight controls, memorable characters, and two-player cooperative gameplay, it was a must-have for any Genesis owner. It is perhaps most famous for its revolutionary soundtrack, composed by the legendary Yuzo Koshiro. His fusion of techno, house, and funk, created using a custom programming language to push the Genesis's YM2612 sound chip to its absolute limits, remains one of the most iconic and influential soundtracks in video game history. Shinobi. The adventures of ninja protagonist Joe Musashi were another staple of the Genesis library. The Revenge of Shinobi, 1989, was an early showcase for the console, a stylish and challenging action platformer. The series reached its zenith with Shinobi 3: Return of the Ninja Master, 1993. This title was a technical tour de force, featuring incredibly fluid animation, fast-paced gameplay, and memorable set pieces, including a thrilling level fought on horseback and another while surfing on a jet ski. It is often cited as one of the best action games on the platform. The Treasure Box. The Genesis's reputation as a powerful and developer-friendly programmer's machine also attracted a new breed of ambitious independent Japanese developers. The most legendary of these was Treasure. Founded in 1992 by a group of ex-Konami employees, their founders were veterans who had worked on acclaimed Super NES titles like Contra 3 and Super Castlevania 4. Frustrated with Konami's focus on sequels and its refusal to greenlight their original game ideas, they left to form their own studio. They specifically chose the Genesis as their platform of choice, believing its faster Motorola 68000 CPU was better suited for the kind of intense, effects-heavy action games they wanted to create. After initially being contracted by Sega to develop the licensed game McDonald's Treasure Land Adventure, they were finally given the green light for their passion project. The result, released in 1993, was Gunstar Heroes, a run-and-gun masterpiece that pushed the Genesis hardware to its absolute breaking point. The game was a dazzling display of technical wizardry, featuring massive, multi-jointed bosses, incredible sprite rotation and scaling effects, and non-stop chaotic action. Its unique weapon combination system, which allowed players to mix and match 4 different weapon types to create 14 unique firearms, gave it incredible depth and replayability. Gunstar Heroes was a critical darling and an instant cult classic, establishing Treasure as one of the most respected and innovative developers of the 16-bit era.
Western wonders. Sega of America's open-door policy also led to groundbreaking collaborations with Western developers, resulting in some of the console's most technically impressive and commercially successful titles. Disney's Aladdin and the Lion King. In 1993, a unique partnership between Virgin Games, Sega, and Disney's own feature animators produced Disney's Aladdin. Using a proprietary Digicel process, Disney animators hand-drew the animation frames for Aladdin and the other characters, which were then digitized and compressed onto the game cartridge. The result was a game with stunningly fluid cartoon-quality animation that was unlike anything seen on a home console before. The game was a massive critical and commercial success, selling over 4 million copies and becoming the 3rd best-selling Genesis game of all time. The following year, the development house Westwood Studios used a similar collaborative process to create the game for The Lion King, which was also a huge seller. Notably, the game's infamous difficulty was a deliberate choice mandated by Disney to prevent children from being able to finish the game during a weekend rental from Blockbuster, thus encouraging them to purchase it instead. Vector Man. In late 1995, as the 16-bit era was winding down, Sega of America's in-house studio, Blue Sky Software, released a final technical showcase for the Genesis. Vector Man was positioned as Sega's answer to Nintendo's Donkey Kong Country, which had wowed audiences with its pre-rendered 3D graphics. To achieve a similar look on the Genesis, the developers at Blue Sky created a technique they called vector piece animation. Instead of a single sprite, the main character, Vector Man, was composed of 23 individual ball-shaped sprites that were programmed to move in unison. This allowed for incredibly fluid, lifelike animation that gave the character a 3D, pre-rendered appearance. The game was a stunning final act for the aging hardware, proving that even in its twilight years, the Genesis still had a few tricks up its sleeve. Hidden gems. Beyond the bestsellers and technical marvels, the Genesis library is beloved for its depth and its wealth of cult classics and hidden gems. Games like the charming and bizarre action roguelike Toe Jam and Earl, the isometric action RPG Landstalker, the frantic 4-player real-time strategy game General Chaos, and the blisteringly fast shooter Musha Aleste gave the console a quirky and diverse library that continues to reward exploration to this day. This rich and varied collection of games, born from a unique confluence of Japanese artistry, American marketing savvy, and a rebellious open platform philosophy, is the true and lasting legacy of the Rebel King. Chapter 8. A Bridge Too Far. The Sega CD and 32X Fiasco. At the peak of its success in the early 1990s, Sega held a commanding lead in the North American console market. The Genesis was a sales juggernaut, and Sonic the Hedgehog was a global icon. But behind the scenes, a series of strategic blunders were set in motion that would not only squander this hard-won dominance, but would also lead to the downfall of the Sega Saturn and ultimately Sega's exit from the hardware business entirely.
The culprits were two ambitious but ill-conceived add-on peripherals for the Genesis, the Sega CD and the 32X. The Siren Song of the CD. In the early 1990s, CD-ROM technology was seen as the undisputed future of gaming. It offered vast storage capacity compared to expensive ROM cartridges, allowing for higher quality music, animated cutscenes, and larger, more complex games. Sega, always eager to be on the cutting edge, moved to embrace this new technology with the Sega CD, known as the Mega CD in Japan and Europe, an add-on that attached to the side of the Genesis console. Launched in North America in late 1992, the Sega CD was an impressive piece of technology. It featured a faster processor from the Genesis itself and the ability to play CD-quality audio. However, it was plagued by two fundamental problems. First, its price. At $299, it was significantly more expensive than the Genesis console it was designed to augment. This made it a luxury item that was out of reach for much of the console's mainstream audience. Second, and more critically, was its software library. While the Sega CD had a handful of genuine classics, such as the brilliant Sonic CD and the acclaimed RPGs Lunar the Silver Star and Snatcher, the library was largely defined by a glut of poorly received full-motion video games. These games, which used grainy, compressed video footage as their primary graphical element, were often derided as interactive movies with shallow gameplay. Titles like Night Trap and Sewer Shark became infamous examples of the genre, and the technology, which had initially seemed so futuristic, quickly became a punchline. The Sega CD sold a disappointing 2.24 million units worldwide, a commercial failure that began to tarnish Sega's reputation for the first time. Project Mars, the panic button. If the Sega CD was a misstep, the 32X was a catastrophic fall from grace. The story of its creation is one of corporate panic. By early 1994, new, more powerful 32-bit consoles like the Atari Jaguar and the 3DO were entering the market. Sega's true next-generation successor, the Sega Saturn, was in development but would not be ready for a worldwide release until late 1995. This created a gap in the market that made Sega CEO Hayata Nakayama deeply anxious. According to former Sega of America producer Scott Bayless, the 32X was born from a single, panicked phone call from Nakayama in January 1994. Worried that the Atari Jaguar would steal Sega's momentum, Nakayama ordered his engineers to create a new piece of hardware, a stopgap measure, and have it on store shelves by the end of the year. The result was Project Mars, which would become the 32X. It was an add-on that plugged into the Genesis's cartridge slot, effectively adding two 32-bit processors to the 16-bit console. It was a powerful device on paper, but its development was rushed and its market position was hopelessly confused. It launched in North America in November 1994, just as Sega was also beginning to talk about its true next-generation console, the Saturn. The 32X was a disaster from every conceivable angle. Developers, already aware that the Saturn was on the horizon, were reluctant to invest resources in what was clearly a short-term dead-end platform. The result was an anemic library of just 40 games, many of which were simply rushed ports of Genesis titles that did little to showcase the hardware's power. Consumers were confused, unsure if they should invest in the 32X or wait for the Saturn. The add-on was discontinued in 1996, having sold fewer than 1 million units. The Seeds of Ruin. The failure of the Sega CD, and in particular the 32X, had devastating long-term consequences that went beyond their poor sales figures. They committed 3 cardinal sins of platform management, the effects of which would directly lead to the failure of the Sega Saturn. First, they fragmented the user base. By creating multiple incompatible hardware configurations, Genesis, Genesis plus Sega CD, Genesis plus 32X, Genesis plus Sega CD plus 32X, Sega created immense confusion for both consumers and developers, paralyzing purchasing decisions and complicating development. Second, they eroded trust. Consumers who had invested hundreds of dollars in the Sega CD and 32X felt betrayed when the platforms were so quickly abandoned. This created a deep sense of brand distrust that made many gamers hesitant to be early adopters of Sega's next console, the Saturn. Retailers were also alienated by the chaotic strategy, with some major chains like KB Toys dropping Sega products entirely after the Saturn's surprise early launch, a debacle made possible by the 32X's disruption of the release schedule. Third, and most critically, the 32X cannibalized the resources needed for the Saturn's success. This was not just a matter of financial or marketing focus, it was a literal, physical cannibalization of components. The 32X and the Sega Saturn used the same family of Hitachi SH2 processors. The frantic rush to manufacture enough 32X units for the 1994 holiday season created a massive parts shortage. This in turn meant that when the Saturn launched in Japan, Sega could not produce enough consoles to meet demand. The Saturn was frequently out of stock during its crucial first year, blunting the momentum of its killer launch titled Virtua Fighter and giving its new rival, the Sony PlayStation, a wide-open window to establish a market lead. The failure of the Genesis add-ons was not a separate event from the failure of the Saturn. It was its primary cause. In a tragic irony, Sega's desperate attempt to prolong the life of its greatest success directly starved its successor of the resources it needed to survive. The bridge to the next generation had been a bridge too far.
Chapter 9: The Echo of the Scream, Legacy and Retrospective. The Sega Genesis's time in the spotlight was brilliant but brief. By 1995, the momentum had shifted decisively in favor of the Super Nintendo, thanks in large part to the groundbreaking pre-rendered graphics of Donkey Kong Country. Sega of Japan, fixated on the upcoming Saturn, made the disastrous decision to prematurely cease support for the Genesis, leaving Sega of America without the inventory to meet the still strong holiday demand. The Genesis had outsold the SNES for 4 consecutive Christmas seasons in the US, but in the end, the Super Nintendo would go on to win the 16-bit war in terms of global lifetime sales, moving 49.1 million units to the Genesis's 30.75 million. But to judge the legacy of the Sega Genesis on sales figures alone is to miss its true, profound impact. The Genesis was not the ultimate winner, but it was the essential challenger. It was the disruptive force that shattered a monopoly, redefined the rules of the industry, and left an indelible echo that can still be heard in the world of gaming today. The architect of the modern console war. The most significant legacy of the Sega Genesis is its role in creating the modern, competitive console industry. Before the Genesis, the market was a de facto Nintendo monopoly, a kingdom with a single, benevolent ruler. Sega's aggressive, confrontational marketing, from Genesis does what Nintendon't to the Sega Scream, was a declaration of war that forever changed how consoles were sold. It transformed the competition from a simple matter of product features into a battle of brands and identities. It injected attitude into hardware marketing, shifting the focus from simple family entertainment to a targeted, demographic-driven lifestyle brand. This strategy proved that a massive, viable market existed for console gaming beyond Nintendo's core audience of young children. By targeting teenagers and young adults with edgier content and a cooler image, Sega dramatically expanded the entire audience for video games. Every console war that followed, from Sony versus Nintendo versus Microsoft to the present day, is a direct descendant of the conflict that Genesis started. Sega's success proved that Nintendo was not invincible, paving the way for future challengers like Sony, whose PlayStation would adopt and refine many of the edgy marketing tactics that Sega had pioneered. An industry forced to mature. The Genesis's rebellious streak also had a lasting regulatory impact. The controversy surrounding the violence in Mortal Kombat and the mature themes in Night Trap brought the industry under the scrutiny of the US government, forcing it to create the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB. While born of controversy, the creation of a self-regulated content rating system was a crucial step in the maturation of video games as a medium, providing parents with the tools they needed to make informed choices and legitimizing gaming as a mainstream form of entertainment. Furthermore, Sega of America's open-door policy towards third-party developers, particularly Western ones, helped to break the near monopoly of Japanese-developed software on home consoles. The success of companies like Electronic Arts on the Genesis proved the viability of American-made console games and helped to foster a more global and diverse development community. An enduring afterlife. Even after Sega ceased production, the Genesis refused to die. Its simple and robust architecture made it easy to license, leading to a long and fascinating afterlife. Companies like Majesco in the US and Tectoy in Brazil continued to produce licensed versions of the console for years. In Brazil in particular, the Master System and Genesis, known there as the Mega Drive, became cultural fixtures, remaining on sale for decades and receiving new, locally developed games long after they had been discontinued elsewhere. In the modern era, the Genesis has enjoyed a powerful retro renaissance. Its library has been re-released through countless compilations on every major platform. In 2019, Sega released the Sega Genesis Mini, a miniature replica of the console preloaded with 42 classic games. Unlike previous poorly emulated plug-and-play systems made by third parties like AtGames, the Genesis Mini was a high-quality, first-party product. The software emulation was handled by the renowned studio M2, ensuring a near-perfect recreation of the original experience. The console was a massive critical and commercial success, a lovingly crafted tribute that finally did justice to the system's history and introduced its legendary library to a new generation. In the end, the story of the Sega Genesis is not a story of victory, but of impact. It was the necessary challenger, the brash upstart that forced a complacent industry to innovate, to compete, and to grow. It may not have held the throne for long, but by daring to challenge the king, it changed the shape of the kingdom forever. The echo of its scream still resonates. Welcome to the next level.